Hey Mandolin friends, today we are talking about Monroe Style with the great Lauren Price Napier. She plays in a band called the Price Sisters with her twin sister Leanna, and Lauren's playing is just phenomenal. You're going to be blown away by the stuff that she plays in this video. But first I have to say, you got to watch out for their new record on McCrory Music coming out later this year. Be on the watch and go check out all of Lauren's stuff online. She teaches online lessons and workshops around the country and around the globe. So be sure to support her music. But for anyone who's interested in this bluegrass Monroe style on the mandolin, this video is for you. We're going to be covering all the building blocks that go into making this style sound the way that it does, the visual shapes, the technique with the right hand, all sorts of cool tips and tricks that Lauren is sharing here. I'm excited. You're going to learn some stuff, and let's just dive right into it.
As a solemn old judge, George D. Hay used to say, here's Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, let her go, boy.
So, I feel like kind of woefully ignorant about Monroe's style and just the traditional side of playing, also like the history of mandolin and bluegrass music, and that's why I'm so excited to get to talk with you today, Lauren. This is gonna be fun. I've got like so many questions, and I feel like I need to start at like square one here because I don't know too much. I was wondering, like, for me and for anyone out there who's watching this and new to Monroe style, if you could just like go over the basics, like what are the building blocks of this style and how do you utilize them when you're playing bluegrass music? I know that's a really broad question, but do you have any places to start that you'd recommend?
Yeah, let me think. It's kind of funny because like you and I were talking, I feel very ignorant when it comes to like the theory and the technical stuff behind a lot of this, but I still like to look at Monroe style, like, unless I'm just learning something, trying to, by transcribe type thing by ear myself, to learn his break on something. If I'm thinking of like improv in Monroe style, I still go back to scales. And because Bill did that, whether he's playing more of a melodic thing, or a lot of people talk about Bill playing over chord shapes and like chord based playing is a Monroe style thing and technique, I guess, if you want to call it that. But at the base of that is still a scale, or oftentimes for me an arpeggio. And so I'm trying to think of like what would be a good direct example. Maybe like Boston Boy or something. I mean, sure. It's like something super simple, but I mean, that's right over your C arpeggio. And so I kind of start there, and then think of, okay, well, Bill to me is a very melody. Oh, excuse us. That's probably going to happen.
That's an awesome little cameo.
Yeah, that's Peanut, by the way.
Peanut. Oh my goodness, that's awesome. That's a great name for a cat.
Anyway, Bill to me is a very melody-based player, but in a sort of abstract way where, like, I tend to resort to a lot of single note lines on your left hand, but not necessarily like in rapid succession. So like where you might be staying on the same note left hand wise, you're picking that same note multiple times.
Right.
To me, it's more about the rhythm and like a shuffle type feel. Because what I was thinking with like that Boston Boy, the bass melody. It's hard for me to even just play, one stop note at a time, because I'm thinking like, okay, well, how can you get more of a shuffle feel in there? Because I think to me that's a lot of what Bill was going around, and I think lots of folks that study Monroe will tell you that it's very fiddle based, not so much note wise, because like, and this is where it probably sounds super vague. I have a hard time picking up on very like distinctly melodic fiddle tunes that have like something like a modern version of Blackberry Blossom for me is really hard to play. And I haven't really applied myself to it that directly, but I like to think of things more. I was talking to Mike Compton about this recently. It's some people think about it like as a mapping technique. And to me, I'm a very visual person, so I told him, it's like, to me, I almost think of like a constellation. And this probably sounds super spacey.
No, that's so cool. I
No
love
pun
this.
intended. But like, you look at the Big Dipper and you've got how many stars that point out what this is supposed to be. But the in-between spaces are kind of a little bit more blurry. Or, like, the Big Dipper is super recognizable, but any of the rest of them, to me, like, okay, I can identify Orion's belt, and the rest of it's like, how does that even look like a person? Yeah, but Bill's stuff to me is kind of the same way. Like, if I can identify, okay, is he playing around like a double stop position, or is he playing more around a chord, like extended arpeggio shape? I don't know if this makes sense or not, but
that makes so much sense. Yeah,
good.
I never thought
if
about
I can
that
kind of
way before.
identify, like, what was he probably going for, and it's not that the in between doesn't matter, because it does, but I think it's easier to make sense of it that way without getting too lost in the detail of it. But back to Boston Boy. Like, if I were playing that, I would go for something like a really kind of like a 1 2 3 and 1 2 3 and 1 2 3 and 1 2 3 rhythm type thing going on. And so you can do that even with whether you're doing chords or double stops or single notes. And it sounds really exaggerated when you do it that way, but when you're just kind of playing, then it sounds like you're doing more than I feel like you are, because you're just really playing into the pick work.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I love that analogy about the constellations, because I never thought about it that way, but it makes total sense. And I'm much more of like a visual player too. Like I don't really hear things in my head before I try to play them, if that makes sense. Like I mostly think about like the arpeggios or the double stop shapes, because those are, I feel like, they're road signs on a map, like another kind of like analogy where you're using those as your visual cues to find the licks or the other surrounding notes that you're playing. You said double stops. I'd love to talk more about that too, because I know like that's a big component of Monroe style playing. Do you think about double stops in link to a particular chord, or do you think about them in relationship to a scale, or both? I know that's a big question too.
No, I know what you mean. I pretty much, no matter what device I'm kind of using to approach a break, whether it's like a scale, like one of at least, well, I mean, every chord has at least 2 scale patterns. Some of them have 3, and then it just repeats, in different places up and down the fretboard. So whether it's like any given scale pattern, like, which this, but like open is, and these are my technical definitions, which is not very technical at all, but like an open scale or closed, which is is just totally parallel with your pinky, or using one over a chord shape. All of those positions lend themselves to different Monroeisms in my mind. And so like, if you're playing over this open position, then you have a lot of open strings that is, it's not a true double stop, but you can really play up that sound. Whereas if you go into the chord shape, that's, still centered around what I would think of as this chord triangle, and
right.
It's notes that are within reach, but I'm kind of thinking, okay, more of a shuffle type pick stroke.
Sure.
And so those were both still more single note applications, but something like this, pinky scale, I mean, that's a position that to me more of a modern bluegrass sound
Yeah.
might
Like,
approach,
totally.
but Bill did too. And I can't think, well, this is probably not a good example. I was trying to think of something in G right off the top of my head, and my die-in bed, his break to my die-in bed comes to mind, but it's not double stop based per se, but it's kind of a nice example of, okay, this sounds super distinctly Monroe, and it sounds super different than anybody else, but he's still using the same devices. Like, he knows that, okay, there's a G note here and a G note here, and you can use your harmony or open strings as harmony. That's basically his break to my die-in bed. And it seems like, whoa, what's going on? But you're just using the notes around that scale, and in that case, bluesing it up a little bit.
Right. That
instead
makes
of the, so I like to analyze things that way, because you can still see like a train of thought, even if it's, it's kind of like English, everybody is speaking the same language, but we have different accents. But more specifically on double stops, and I don't mean to just ramble.
No, that's great.
Something like his break to Midnight on the Stormy Deep comes to mind, because he did that in the key of E, and it revolves around that, or at least I like to frame it that way, even though you're using the double stops more than you are single notes to still portray the melody.
Right.
And then he kind of does an arpeggiated thing. And so I like that break, because to me it's really simple, like if you were to look at it on paper. It's not really going off the wall or off the beaten path, but you can still play with your mix of double stops versus single notes. And so, like, I like to think of, okay, if I'm playing over a position that's closed and you can't rely on open strings and so on and so forth, then how do you decide when to use single note lines and when to use double stops? And it's kind of just, I look at it like, your verse is just kind of like a structure of sentences. And so at what point do you need to put punctuation in there versus kind of carry on through the line? And so if you're looking for like punctuation or definition, then I'd say, okay, well, let's put some single notes in here to accent it. And I would imagine that it's kind of the same approach for you, even different, or anybody, even though styles might differ. But I don't know, does that make sense?
Absolutely. Too? Yeah. I love how like the double stops are so tied to that shape too, like in E, like having that like fifth and root double stop here, and then like the third and root, and then even like that A double stop there, kind of hinting at that a little bit.
Yeah. And that's very much what I would hear him falling back on in any sort of, and like I'm Blue and Lonesome too. Something like that. I mean, it's super simple in terms of you're just playing kind of a modified arpeggio, I suppose, too, if you will, around that, but then blurring the lines with your phrasing or your note choice, whether you want to flatten something or slide into it or so on and so forth. A lot of it, to me, like I said when we started out, I just look for, okay, where is like A to F, or so, I mean, not note wise, but like point A to Z maybe would be a better, like, you know, if this is okay, this is my first and here's the end, and then what do you have that works in between that around the scale, and then what are some examples that I know that Bill played that might reference this, or I could use for reference, you know, to kind of construct what I think I want to do in that any given key or something.
That makes a lot of sense about the punctuation analogy too, where like I guess you want the points you want to punctuate to are the chord changes, and like where, you know, you're starting off on the tonic, the root of the chord, you probably want to play like a double stop there to establish the harmony. And if you land on like a 5 chord at the end of a phrase, you might want to punctuate that with like a you know, a 5 chord double stop, and having that be your guideline too.
For me too, a lot of it comes back to melody. Like I feel like improving is and playing backup is my weak spot, because like in a performance setting, I don't do a lot of gigs just because of where I'm at and stuff. A lot of gigs unless it's with, you know, Leanna and our band, and so most of the time then I'm singing, so I don't think of like working on my backup and how to do that a lot, because I'm just not in that setting. And so I feel like that's my weak point. But to that end, whenever I go to do something that, you know, I don't have a good reference for, then I think, well, I feel like I'm just a very melody based player, which is nothing wrong with. I'll always tell people to play the melody if you don't know where else, you know, that's where you should start, I guess.
Yeah,
you know, I'm making it sound like a bad thing when it's not, but when it goes to, when you want to like make it a little bit more interesting beyond that, then something that like we do a version of, I think it's titled it. Oh.
Hey, Peanut.
Peanut. She's very friendly.
Oh, hello. Star of the show.
You're very cute. Okay.
Does she mind the mandolin?
Yeah. She's a music fan.
That's good. That's good. It'd have to be, right?
But anyway, we do a version of Where Is My Sailor Boy, but we call it What Does the Deep Sea Say? And Bill did it with Doc Watson. I think they did it in C, and so like, but we do it in A. That's something I'll always tell people too, which is kind of off topic, but especially for females, I think always play it where you have to sing it. And I learned that one the hard way.
Good idea.
But I mean, no matter who your favorite player is, it's not worth not being able to sing it just to play it where they did. So
totally. Yeah.
I digress. But I tried to make a break in A like Bill would have done like Bill did in C. And this is what I would call more of a Monroe chord style break. But when you break it down even further, it's just arpeggios to me anyway. And then, okay, how many double stops do you have within reach around a chord position? So there's like the root one in my mind is just kind of this midpoint, but you also have that. And like, so within your chord shape, you have a group of 3 distinct double stops, but then around that, you also have, just depending on how you want to voice stuff. And so it's that's how I approach a lot of the chord-based playing. So like for deep C, that's very so blurry, but it also follows the melody pretty well at the points in which I think it should hit those notes. By contrast, something like I'm on my way back to the old home, you could approach it very similarly. But you would want to play that note to me. I'm on my way back to the old home, because that still speaks to the melody instead of just and instead of just kind of going nuts over the, thinking too much in the position and then not just where's my melody. And I'm kind of losing it, but melody wise, I guess I still try to define it around that, you know, even if it's not so concrete.
Yeah.
Kind of like punctuation. I think you just
Uh-huh.
need to pick and choose what feels most key to the break you're playing.
I love that you're showing those double stops around like the chop chord too. Like, I don't know if you experience much like in your teaching, but I know like a lot of students of mine, they struggle with like the chop chord shape. Not even just as a melodic figure, but you know, just playing the chop. And often, you know, the temptation is just to skip it or to move past it and do something different when there's so much melodic wealth within that shape that, you know, Bill helped pioneer, which is so amazing. Really cool getting to hear you play that. Do you have any tips for folks who are struggling like with the chop shape on how to, you know, get beyond that struggle, especially with the 4-finger shape?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much just, which I'm sure you do too, just try to stay encouraging about it, because like I know it's tough, and it looks easy for us to say because we do it all the time nowadays, but there was still a point in which it's like, this feels impossible. But I am such a heavy hitter on positions. Like, am I playing around a scale position here? Am I playing around a chop position? And how much that is movable. I think that's why I try to stress its importance. Just like, okay, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, like, I sneak open notes into things when they're technically wrong a lot of times because I like the way it sounds. But it's like, you know, if you're playing around this, it doesn't matter if you're in the key of A. You can do the same thing in G or C, high or low. And in that case, which, you know this too, but I'm not even thinking about what note names I'm playing. I'm just memorizing. I'm just the muscle memory of knowing that chop shape. And so that's why, to me, it's so important beyond just being the half of the rhythm section in a band setting, you know. But a lot of folks, I'll just start with, get your 3 fingers strong and confident. And that to me is equally as difficult to do, though, because you have to train your right hand to not pick up an extra string. But it's kind of a trade-off, because then for a lot of folks it still is physically easier left hand wise. And so that's what I'll do a lot with folks. Just get used to this, because to me this 3-finger shape is a little bit more this is what is mostly movable to me. I mean, obviously your pinky goes in with it, but you don't end up playing a lot of notes with your pinky out of a chop position, unless it's just kind of like a tag type thing. So this is still like the core of what that revolves around, because it's how you play your arpeggio. So if you're struggling with chopping, I would still stress, okay, let's just do this for now. Even if you don't think you'll ever be able to use your pinky, this is really where this is where the meat of it is, in terms of being able to move around and play in different places. You don't really need your pinky to do a lot of that. But then by the time you get comfortable and with doing all that, and even forget that your pinky is involved, you'll probably be, I don't want to say good enough, but you'll have built up the skill enough to where you can probably just take off using your pinky at that point, you know, without even thinking, because you've just been playing longer. So it's kind of a mind over matter thing, which I know is sounds easy for any of us to say, but
it's true with anything, and music in particular too. It's just, you have to see like people like yourself and other amazing artists like doing stuff like this, and know that it's possible, and then just, you know, apply your troubleshooting mind and try to figure out how to do it, I guess.
Yeah, well, and I tell folks too, I went for years and did not use my pinky at all. I did chop, but like to play, I didn't use it. And because I'm double jointed, and so I have like a catch in this knuckle, and so sometimes it sticks. And so for a long time I used that as an excuse. It's like, well, my pinky doesn't work right. But it still makes it uncomfortable at times, and I'm not as quick with it as I'd like to be. But I tell folks that just to say, it's like, you know, I went for a long time trying to avoid it, but finally it's like, you know, I got to do this if I really want to be able to progress on stuff. And so it works as much as you want it to work, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. It's like I've heard it described as the fixed mindset versus the learning mindset, where oftentimes we say, "Oh, I can't do that." I'm not a fast player, or I can't play the chop chord, and that's the one thing that stops you from trying and actually getting better at it. Whereas if you say, "Okay, I can't do this yet, but I want to work on it, and I know I can improve and get better, even if I'm not going to be the best mandolin player in the world, I still want to learn," and that like helps you push through that initial roadblock and help you accomplish a lot more than you think you can. And speaking of which, one of those things that I find in myself, like where I feel as a fixed player, is I often think I can't play tremolo, and I'm not that good at it, and so often I don't practice it. And I know like that's a huge component of the Monroe style too. I was wondering if you could speak to that, if anyone out there struggling with tremolo, how you would approach it from this particular style playing.
Tremolo itself is one of those like where I feel like I have weak points as a player. I mean, I know I do. Tremolo, for whatever reason, is something that I've actually always felt really natural with. But I think in Monroe style, and I tell people this in camps and workshops and lessons, I'm never going to tell you have to hold your pick this way and only this way, because a lot of people ask that, and depending on stylistically what you're going for, tone wise, all that, different things promote, advantages one way or the other, pros and cons. But for Monroe style, I think the style of pick grip that I use is similar to what I see in Bill's playing and other Monroe style greats that are my heroes. I think that's a lot. I try to make my right hand look a lot like theirs, because that's what I like. But it also feels advantageous to what I'm going for anyway.
Sure.
However, I think it is really good for tremolo because I also have a bad habit of using too much elbow when I get in a hurry, because I used to.
Me too. I do that all the time.
I used to rest the base of my hand on the bridge, and so at that point I was only playing with my wrist, and that's great. But I was also playing at more of like a pick angle than what I prefer to play, and so eventually I talked myself out of like, okay, I'm going to get out of this, and I want my hand to be more straight up and down on the strings, floating wrist. But the trade-off for that is that now that I am totally floating, if I get in a hurry, I'll resort to my elbow, which is bad, as everybody knows.
I struggle with that so much too. Like whenever I start playing faster or get tense, like my wrist just kind of locks, and I just do the jackhammer.
It's the same for me, totally. And I think it's just because I think the only way to fix that stuff is just totally be conscious of it, which is really hard to do in the moment. But I digress. Speaking to my pick hold, I like to tell folks that in general, no matter if you're sitting, I mean, because we sit and play a lot, and then the neck of the mandolin ends up going kind of more up, or standing, I like to think that I'm trying to get the neck of the mandolin like parallel with the ground, because to me that frees up my shoulders and my arms and stuff to be less tense than if I'm playing like this, because then and this is just me, but my range of motion feels a lot more limited if I'm sitting like this, or even if I'm standing playing into a microphone like this, because maybe if you're a big tall guy you can do that and that's fine, but to me it's hard to do that and still feel comfortable playing. So definitely. Whether I'm sitting or standing, I like to play with this pretty well straight, almost like from my elbow, all the way up the strings, because that lets my wrist be more relaxed. And so in holding the pick, and I'm getting to tremolo with this, but in awesome. Holding the pick, it's kind of like, it's very loose. It's tight enough to where you don't drop it, but really there's no squeeze here at all, because it's kind of laying like on the top edge of my index finger, and so then your thumb just goes right on top.
Party foul there, drop my pick.
Yeah, and it feels really weird at first, but the only way for me to do this and not drop the pick is that you end up covering almost all of it, but just enough to where it sticks out to catch the strings, and then it pretty much has the flexibility to, and this is something that Compton talks about a lot, but it's universal, I think, within this style, just to give you that texture, and I think it gives you more control. When you try to hold it that way, it feels like you have no control because it feels like you're going to drop it. But once you get used to it, I think it gives you more control of manipulating, like how hard you're playing, or let me see, because if I'm playing something really hard, I can feel that like working my thumb, sort of. Yeah. But then for tremolo, if it's softer, you can feel the pick doing this within
flexing
your grip. And I do this in person in workshops a lot, and it's probably kind of difficult to convey virtually. But if you were to watch my right hand, you can hear a difference without seeing a difference, but then I can explain the difference. So like this is how I would play tremolo. And it sounds, it was kind of sloppy, but it sounds soft, more or less. Now, not doing anything differently out, or from the outside, but it sounds a lot more broken up that way, and that was just pushing together on the pick versus really no pressure at all, down or up. Hopefully you can see this, but like I said, in how I would play tremolo, you can feel the pick just moving, like wiggling in between the fingers. And so that gives you, when you play a downstroke, you can see it kind of coming up. And then when you play an upstroke, you can see it kind of angling down. And so you're not changing the direction that you're exuding force, I guess, but you're giving the pick its own flexibility to work with you, I think, in that case. And so I think you have better manipulation over the texture that you're going for. Tremolo wise, I'm also a big fingerboard clicker, and you got to be careful with that because it's easy to get sloppy. I like it for texture, but it still can sound sloppy if you overdo it. But a lot of times in tremolo, I will go up onto the extension, and because I like the tonality of that better than even in the midpoint. Not just playing on top of the bridge, but even at the midpoint, it's more broken apart than it is up here.
Just one question about your right hand. Is the pick kind of directly on top of your thumb joint there? Is that right? Or
I guess actually it kind of is, but I hadn't really thought of that before.
I'm just curious.
Because I like index finger wise, it's like a closed position without being a squeezed fist. Okay. And so it's like just enough to curl that first joint in is where it sits there. But then for my thumb, I would like to think of it more as being like the pad of your thumbprint.
Okay, cool.
However, in actuality, it's kind of like split the difference between that and your joint.
In the joint. Yeah, okay. Sense. That makes sense, yeah. I thought I'd seen like Compton do something similar like that too, and I've always like played with my pick way out on the pad, which I feel like makes me play a lot lighter. Do you think that helps like produce a lot more volume, having the pick closer to the base of the thumb, if that makes sense?
I think it can, because like I said, I don't change my pick grip at all from what I'm playing, but I think in this regard you can change your force within that. And so like if I'm playing something softer, I mean that's kind of just basic run of the mill as far as dynamic goes. But then if you want to get into something like my die in bed, where you are playing harder, a lot of it comes to me like, and not to overwork your thumb, but a lot of it for me is kind of within your thumb and just applying a little bit more pressure instead of, that's a little bit more ergonomic, I think, instead of trying to really beat on it more. You can just kind of put a little bit more oomph in your pick stroke itself.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's surprising how much power is in like the smaller muscles of your wrists and fingers, and I often find like I'm working too hard with my elbow to create that. And I don't even remember, but Bill, I feel like I remember him using a lot of wrists as well too. Is that right? Like, was he predominantly a wrist player, you feel like, for melody and double stops?
I believe so. And like I said, I have a horrible elbow habit. It's not as bad as it could be, but mostly like if I get in a hurry or if I get anxious and nervous on the spot, then I will lock up if I'm trying to go quick or something. But Bill was a wrist player. I mean, it depends on what you're playing. If it's just more kind of single note stuff or basic tunes, it will look very obviously wrist. If it's more of the heavy stuff, then you'll see a lot of this going on, but your elbow moves by default.
Right.
Obviously.
Mm-hmm.
I think still most of the playing is directed from your wrist, because in those moments when I know I am playing from my wrist and nowhere else, you can hardly feel any tension, which is wonderful because it's so comfortable.
That's amazing. Yeah.
But it's hard to achieve that because it's kind of like a letting go thing, to where I feel like I'm losing control because my pick grip is pretty loose, and so then if this feels loose, then it's like I'm getting sloppy, but it's just me not working on it enough.
So another quick question about the right hand. I know like Monroe Style is kind of known for the different tone colors that you can get out of this register here, like the really harsh sound and the bright and powerful sound next to the bridge, and then also like you were saying with tremolo playing over the fretboard a little bit. Do you consciously make those decisions, or is that something that you feel, just moved in the moment to do one or the other depending on what you're playing or who you're playing with?
Yeah, no, I do it pretty consciously, enough to where it probably is subconscious at this point in certain settings, but I do try to do it consciously.
Sure, yeah.
Because that's how I approach things, like stuff like for our album, for example, making up breaks. Okay, well, what if you have to play something one time and then another time through? How do you differ on that? Well, a lot of times it'll just be to change the octave.
That's awesome. Yeah.
But there's one song that we did in B where the front of it was kind of more single note downstroke heavy, where then I did and I'm messing this up, but just for example, something like that, then I'm closer to the bridge because it's more of a kind of a crisp and a harsh sound. But then if I move up here, then I've automatically just gone farther up on the fingerboard to contrast it dynamically. So I don't know if I can get through this and play it, but it probably would be easier to play it and just hear the difference than me trying to keep talking about it.
I'd love to hear it. No, this is great.
Let me see. And then tremolo. Something like that, where there's kind of, to me, it's two very different styles, but within the same realm of Monroe stuff. Just different dynamic approaches, I guess, is where I kind of determine how I want this to sound, what suits, for these single notes. That is more of a harder sound to where I'll move back to the bridge. Or this is a little bit more moody type thing, where I might move up here so it sounds a little bit more soft and implied, whether as opposed to super obvious, like a. So for lines like that, I'll stick up here, where if it's something like then I'll obviously move closer to the bridge because it's like that would sound funny to me if it was.
Right.
Well, it doesn't sound that different, but
No,
it sounds a little bit more like you're playing an oval hole, which is fine. If you're up here for something like that, like instead of, there's just a tonal difference. So it's kind of just whatever you prefer. But yeah, I do consciously play around with that a lot, just to change it up.
It's so emotive. Like you can just feel like the different feelings of the vocabulary and what's going on in the music. I love that. It's really dynamic. One other related question there too. I know a lot of people ask about the downstroke, like the repeated downstroke style that Monroe did for like Bluegrass stomp and stuff like that. I can't do it very well. I'd love to learn how to do it better. And I still have trouble switching between kind of like maybe a 16th note feel and an 8th note feel with the right hand as far as alternating pick directions. How do you keep your right hand alternating? When do you decide to do like the multiple downstrokes, and when do you get back to playing more alternate stuff like you were doing on Boston Boy earlier?
I think kind of like what you were saying, it depends on the timing of the note groups that you're looking at. And so, which can be varied itself just depending on how you want to do it.
Right.
Something that comes to my mind is his kickoff to True Life Blues from the early days. It's crazy. Let me see. That's like almost all downstrokes so far.
Whoa, that's crazy.
When you're doing that, to me, it's a lot of downstrokes very close together, but it's still achievable kind of because of the rhythm underneath it. It's kind of more that fast, like almost like a bop type feel to me. Where something like Bluegrass Stomp, I don't know. It still works because it's just very like, and this is where I get theoretically ignorant, but I don't want to say on top of the beat, but it's very punctuated to me to where I still feel like you can kind of get in that rhythm and just keep going. But then where it gets tricky is if I want to do that for this phrase and then change it up in the next phrase, it's really hard to break in between once you get in like that, locked into that pattern. Let me see, because there's a line in like Bluegrass Special, if I can remember it. Like that. That technically should be almost all downstrokes, but I can barely do it because even like that phrase itself, I am prone to alternating on just because it's like, it's hard for me to jump across three strings with all downstrokes.
Yeah, such different timing.
And so I think it kind of just depends on your discretion at the time, but that might be a good example because it's a pretty simple line if you slow it down, and to do it in all downstrokes is fine. But to do it up to speed, I can't do it all downstrokes without, I guess, repetition. But that might be where I would be like, okay, I got to break this and alternate for a second just to give myself some relief. I guess I don't know if that probably got a little off track from your question.
No, that was totally on top. It kind of just
depends on context.
Yeah.
For me.
I know a lot of that like stems from the actual way that Bill played it too, like trying to dig into his recordings and figure out what he's doing too. It's kind of another topic I wanted to mention as well. Like I took a couple lessons from Mike Compton when I was living in Nashville, which was so fun. And he sent me all these transcriptions of note for note transcriptions of how Bill played certain tunes or breaks from early recordings, and just the amount of detail that goes into that. Like I had no idea that Monroe players were that specific about like how many repeated notes and how many, all these little subtle details of how Monroe played it. It was just amazing. And I was wondering, like, is that how you approach it as well? And if so, like, how do you dig into learning stuff by ear like that?
It is, I think, like you said, how many repeated notes. I think that's a huge part of Bill's sound that gets overlooked. Not on purpose, and not ignorance sounds like ignorance is the wrong word to use, but just because it goes by so quickly to your ear, you don't even notice it.
Right.
And for myself included. But that's a lot of, like, whenever I think, oh, he's playing this note and this note, a lot of times he's staying on the same one. And it sounds like movement because he's implying melodic changes more with his right hand than actually doing them with his left hand. Something like this, Tanyard's, it sounds like it should be, more kind of a chromatic thing than it actually is. Where there's a lot of just, your left hand is not really moving that much. And so a lot of the feel of Bill's playing comes from repeated notes. One of the recordings of I'm on My Way Back to the Old Home, I think in A, there's a lot of just floating on, if I can slow that down, maybe. Like, if you were to look at that on paper, it's like there's a 2 here and a 4 here and maybe some open notes in between. And you string it together, it's a lot of individual notes, but you're not really changing from place to place that much. Mm-hmm. And so when you slow it down and break it apart, it doesn't seem like you're doing much. Something like that. I know that still wasn't super slow, but you could probably hear how you're not really moving around that much. But when it's up to speed, something like that. It sounds like you're fitting a lot more in there than what you're actually playing, but it's big right hand. Almost like a tremolo that's constant but slow. It's just kind of the pattern of playing, if that makes sense.
That's amazing. Yeah, that sounds so good, Lauren. I definitely got to go back and learn these after we're done here. I was wondering before we go if you would mind just sharing one of your favorite Monroe style licks that you like playing that, you know, could be movable up and down using some of those different shapes we were talking about.
Sure. It's kind of like the standard thing that people think of in G because it's so identified with Mule Skinner blues. But that in and of itself is just a variation of a G arpeggio lick. Okay, that's more or less what he did for Mule Skinner blues. But you can change that so many ways depending on your context and how it best fits into the phrase that you've got at the time. So, like, that's just descending on your... I still refer to it as arpeggio at the very, like totally spaced out level of it.
That makes sense.
But you're still playing more notes than that. Like, you know, your G, D, C, B flat to B, and back to G. That in that regard, you can kind of play those as individually picked notes. Or, okay, well, if, let's say, where we have B flat to B picked as 2 individual notes in example A, exhibit B, okay, let's turn that into a slide. So you've taken one note out of the space and you have to substitute. You still have to fill that space somewhere else to fit into the phrase. Okay, so why not tack another note on the end of it? So instead of A, you can do, and it fits the same space. It sounds different to your ear, but you're not really doing something super complicated. I revolve around this a lot. That's the midpoint double stop of any chop chord, and so this is where it becomes movable, because that type of pattern where it's open A, in this case open A, B flat to B, and then your G note. But a lot of times where the rhythmic sense of Bill's playing comes in, I think, is on the upstrokes, which is one of those things that also falls between the cracks a lot. Because this is down, up, down, up, down. So it's all alternating, but when you start the pattern over again, you leave out the A note in this case. So then you start it over with your upstroke on the B flat. So down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. And so that's how you really get into a groove really quickly, but you're locked into, it's truly alternating, but you've kind of like flipped the accent of it, maybe.
That makes sense.
And that's where a lot of people might start to put a descending slide in from the 5 of your chord here, the D note in this case, backwards until it's time to go forwards again, and then down. And so that's where you can, that's where I use that a lot, because it's like it's a lick, but it's not either, but you can put it anywhere. Not like you play in C sharp very much, but in case you need to,
if you
can, because same idea.
I love that. It's so like changeable and so expressive, depending on how you feel. You can mix things up and it's still the same idea, the same mechanics at work. It's so cool.
That's how I like to look at it, because it demystifies a lot of it to me. It doesn't mean it's all a piece of cake, and it doesn't mean it's a lot of people, I think, don't give Monroe Style enough credit because it's just kind of passed off as being thrashy and sloppy, and it's like, oh boy, it's a lot. Which I don't mean that on my. I mean, I'm no expert compared to some of my heroes on it, but it's a lot harder when you dig into it than what it might appear on the surface, because, like we talked about earlier, you might look at, okay, you're only playing like 6 different notes here, but how are you getting that textured sound and so much like dynamics in your rhythm and that kind of thing? And so I think that's what made Bill's playing so interesting to me.
Yeah, I know anyone watching this video would strongly disagree with you being a sloppy player and just the amount of work and effort you put into your music. It's such a subtle art form, and I love that there's so much detail and so many aspects that go into it that make this so beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing all this information with us, Lauren. I've learned so much, and I have like a list of things I need to go work on like right now.
Well, same here, only on the flip side, like we said when we first got on, I mean, it's like where I feel like this is what I know, then with stuff that I don't know, I'm just as uncomfortable as anybody else might be. So I really appreciate it, because it's fun to talk about. I mean, it's fun. And it's interesting for me to hear different perspectives on the same thing too, because it's like I talk, I'm a visual learner, but everybody learns differently. And so where I might not be super good at teaching somebody how to read music, if I can teach you the way that I try to understand it, but also relate it to your perspective as much as I can, it's like I over explain things a lot of times, because I like to look at like 3 different ways of explaining something, because chances are if this person doesn't get it this way, they might get it this way, So it's, I like, I don't know. I like having conversations about this stuff, even when I feel like, I may not know what I'm talking about. You can always learn something from somebody else too.
Folks watching this video, you definitely have to go check out Lauren's music with the Price Sisters, also her teaching online and at workshops around the country, around the globe as well. So much to learn here. I'm gonna have to follow up with some private lessons as well and get your advice on some of my playing.
We'll swap.
That'd be amazing.
I really appreciate it, David. This has been really fun. So
It's been so fun, Lauren. Yeah, thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
yeah, you too.